Welcome everyone. This is the first session of the day, so I appreciate everybody coming straight from breakfast, probably a little bleary-eyed from everything last night, staying up late. Introduce myself, I'm Jeff Conrad, and with me today co-presenting is Andrew. Both of us work on the Access test team, so we hope to make sure that everything with our product is obviously bug-free and works very well. What we want to talk to you today is about building SharePoint apps with Microsoft Access. We've been giving a similar type of presentation at other events recently, and for the most part we found a lot of people still haven't heard about this, so we're hoping that we're doing the same thing here. If you haven't heard about this material, this is a good way to introduce all the work that we've done with Access 2013, built on top of SharePoint and Office 365. We're going to have about 65 minutes of presentations and demo, and then we're going to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A at the mics. Probably going to have lots of questions, so please make sure if you have questions, just wait till the end and we'll have plenty of time for you. The session objectives today, we want to make sure that you're introduced to Access 2013, all the great work that we've done. If you're already familiar with Access, that's great. If you haven't heard what we've done with 2013, this is the right place to be. Some of the key takeaways we want to give you is that when you're building Access 2013 web apps, they're on top of SharePoint. They're very easy to create. They're very approachable from the end users to create applications. Pro developers could also do a lot with these as well. But the idea with Access and the rapid application development, we're just extending that from the desktop into the cloud. And the real key thing is that these are centrally managed by IT because they're within SharePoint and SQL Server. So, how many of you are familiar with Access desktop applications? There's probably quite a few of you in the room. I'm sure as some of these items that come up on the screen, you're probably familiar with some of the problems with Access desktop applications. It's difficult to track how many of these MDB files and ActDB files are floating around the organization, how many of these are on local shares, who's backing these up, how mission critical are some of these. For the most part, when we talk with IT doesn't like Access per se. They usually want to purge Access completely from their system. It doesn't negate the fact that the end users still need to create Access applications. There's a need for those particular very quick, rapid application systems that are just maybe small, interdepartmental type of applications. Sometimes these grow up into very mission-critical applications. So this leads us to the next question of why would you want to build a SharePoint app on top of Access? We hope to answer that within the next hour. We essentially now have two products within one within Access, and this is how we think of our product. We have all the desktop application stuff, and that's on the left side of the screen there. All of that functionality is still in the product. You can have full, rich VBA. It's used by millions of people. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of applications out there. How many of these are being used? All of that functionality is still there. We haven't taken that away. But what we have done is made a large shift to doing Access web apps. And that's what we're going to be covering today. We're not talking anything about the desktop applications. With the Access web apps, the data is now stored directly within SQL. That was a huge shift for our team and a huge amount of work. When you're creating an Access web app, if you're on-prem with SharePoint 2013, it's going to create local SQL Server database. If you're on Office 365, it's going to create it in SQL Azure. And of course, that's completely managed by Microsoft. It's accessible through any web browser. Doesn't matter if it's Internet Explorer. We're much more open-ended with other browsers. So you can actually use Access web apps with any of the current web browsers. There's essentially no code. You're just writing macros if you want to do some of the logic. We will actually do a lot of the work for you in creating these applications. Throughout this week, you're going to hear the word apps probably way too often. Probably a little confusion on what the difference in the different apps model type is. So this slide just gives you a little bit of differentiation there. With our Access web apps, we are essentially a SharePoint app. If you're familiar with apps for Office, you've probably heard some of these sessions already. You're going to definitely hear some more throughout the week. Think of it like an app for Office is essentially like an extension, an add-in. We have a session tomorrow that Andrew and Gary from our team are going to be leading. We hope you can go to that. We're happy and pleased to announce that you can actually consume Apps for Office Insight Access Web Apps. That functionality is literally just starting to light up within Office 365, probably any day now. And so we have a session tomorrow afternoon. We really hope you can go to that. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there with maps and charts. When we think of Access, there's a different range of different skill sets involved with creating Access applications. Throughout its 20-year history, Access has been around. The end users that can create application, we want to make it sure it's very approachable, but there's a big grow-up story, and usually professional developers have made some very mission-critical applications within Access. For Access 2013, we want to make sure, and that's what we're targeting, is that end users can create these applications and get started very quickly. That doesn't mean a more experienced professional developer could not create an Access application. In fact, they can probably add a lot more functionality on top of what, say, an end user is just using one of our templates. At the far end of the spectrum, we of course have the really high-end professional developer. The professional developer can create apps for SharePoint as well. They can also create apps for Office, which can then be consumed by Access web apps. We typically don't see end users going to be the ones that are actually going to create apps for Office, but they can consume those. If you've heard Napa throughout this week, those can be used to create apps for Office, but keep in mind that will just be consumed by an Access web app. So that's tomorrow's session. Visual Studio, of course, is for the very high-end professional developer. We also think of the simple versus structured. One really nice thing about Access is that it's approachable and simple from the standpoint of, say, for example, an Excel user. It doesn't require a lot of skill set to just add a new column into Excel or add a formula. We want that simplicity. The downside to those simplistic systems is sometimes you don't have the data control that you want. You don't have relationships. On the structured side, this is where you have the full high-end professional applications. These are the ones that take hundreds of thousands of dollars or more of application time. I'm sure some of you have been involved with some of those applications where they, of course, always landed on time, always on budget, never went over. Of course, I see people shaking their head already. So what we want to make sure is, for Access, we're kind of taking that sweet spot right in the middle. We can still have the simple design surface for creating the apps, but we still have all the structure and all that rich functionality behind the scenes. Because we're baked right on top of SQL Server, because we're baked right in with SharePoint, we already have all that rich functionality, permissions, and SQL Server all behind the scenes. In this first demo, Andrew's going to show you very quickly how he can create a new SharePoint app using Access 2013. He's going to start off using one of our table templates. And he's going to show in roughly about 60 seconds, so don't time him because he's going to be talking along the way. But in just a matter of a couple of minutes, he's going to create a new SharePoint app.
Thank you, Jeff. So we are going to create an Access web app so that our admin can track the assets on the Access team. So to get started, we're in our home screen for our SharePoint. We just had to click the Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps button. Click that. Now it's going to show you several SharePoint templates that you can use to create an app. But we're going to create a blank Access app. So I just need to search for Access in the box. And right here is where we can create a blank Access app. So all we need to do is click on it, give it a name. We're going to call this one Assets. Now you'll also see here that you have the ability to upload an Access app package. If you've already created an app and you've packaged it together, you can move it from site to site, and you would do that through this link here. We're going to go ahead and create a blank one. So all I need to do is hit Create. Now, our admin needs to be able to track the assets on the Access team. There's about 70 members of the Access team, and we all have laptops, desktops, monitors, surfaces, all these assets that belong to Microsoft. So the admin wants a way to track them and see who they're assigned to. So currently, right now, we are creating a SQL Azure database in the back end, because this is Office 365, and a SharePoint app in our site collections that is going to show us the UI that corresponds to the data in the backend. So there you see we've already created the app. We can now open it. Now this is a blank app, so there's nothing in it right now. So you come to a landing page where it's going to tell you that you can start designing your app. Now the design time for these Access web apps is done in the Access client, and the runtime stays here in SharePoint on Office 365. So to open this in the designer, we can either click this link right here, or you can go up to the gear in the top right and hit Customize in Access. Then just open that up, and this is going to launch Access and connect it up with the SharePoint site that we just created and give us that design surface to start working on our app. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is define our schema for the app. We could do that in a number of different ways. If we already had existing data, then we could come down here to create a table from an existing data source. So you could create it from Access, you can import data from Excel, from SQL Server, or link to SharePoint lists. If we knew the schema we wanted and just want to start creating tables, we can start adding blank tables to this application and start defining our schema that way. But as Jeff mentioned, we're going to use a new feature in Access 2013, which is table templates. So we know that we want to track assets in this application. So we just need to search for assets, and it's going to bring up all the table templates related to assets. Now, if I click this table template, it's going to create some SQL Server tables, in the SQL Azure on the back end, and some UI to consume those tables. In addition, it's going to create some relationships between the tables. We on Access know that database relationships are really tough for people to understand. But if we can show you how they're created and how powerful they can be, then the end user really starts to grasp the concept. So here you'll see that it's created those three tables, assets, categories, and employees. And when we click on the assets table, we now come to the design view, and we can start designing our form. But we're just going to use the form that Access has created for us and go view that in the web. So here we are now back in our SharePoint site. We can start adding data. It's all there in Office 365 with a database in the back end in roughly 60 seconds. Thank you.
Great. Good job. Now, there was actually a lot of complexity there. Can you switch back to the slide for me? Looked like it was just pretty easy. He just created a new SharePoint app using the entry point there. Afterwards, there's a lot of complexity happening behind the scenes. Now, in that short amount of time, what he did is he just used the entry point, created a new app, used one of our existing table templates to get himself a jump start on actually using some schema and some views. And then he was essentially ready to go. He could immediately start entering data right from there. There's relationships set up, there's indexes in there, there's forms associated with this, already ready to go. Behind the scenes, there is a lot going on. There's a lot of complexity behind the scenes, but you don't need to know all of that. The end user doesn't need to know all of that. The end user doesn't need to know all the complexities of SharePoint and SQL Server. So the web browser is our runtime for our Access 2013 web apps. Don't need to install anything if you're just the end user who's actually going to use the app and add some data, edit some data. The client is the design surface. So all the things that you want to design, you want to create tables and queries and forms, macros, that's all done within Access, but when you click Save, refresh your browser, everything's up there already. There's no publish, there's no syncing stuff, it's just save and it's up there. On top of Office 365 is a service called Access Services, and that's doing all the heavy lifting. That's doing all the interaction between the client and SQL Server and SharePoint. So when you're creating views, now not to confuse people if you're very familiar with SQL Server, we use the term views to define forms. I know it's a little confusing, but just think whenever you hear the word view for us here, it's actually a form. JavaScript is actually driving all of the forms. You don't need to know JavaScript. You're just going to write macros if you want to automate some of the UI. Behind the scenes is a full SQL Server database. You create one SharePoint app, that creates one SQL database. Local versus on Office 365, it's going to be SQL Azure. So Access is actually creating the objects, The web browser is going to consume those through Access services. Everything about your app, all the tables, the data, everything, all the structure is contained within that SQL database. If you're on-prem, that's going to be in a SQL 2012 or higher local install. We essentially have three big components there behind the scenes. We have the new app model, we have the SharePoint deployment, and we have the SQL backend. The first one, let's talk about the app model in a little bit more sense. And Andrew's going to show more of this in just a second. That new app model, we have a polished professional UI. As you saw, he didn't have to take any time in actually creating that. We built some UI for him. Now, he can make some customizations to that, but very quickly you can build that UI. You don't have to spend a lot of time actually doing that. And it's consistent across all the apps. We essentially have an app model that has the tables, we have the views across. So if you have one person that's familiar with that one app, they should be able to use another app later on. Since we're baked into SharePoint, we get a lot of stuff for free. We just inherit the SharePoint site permissions that were within that site contents page. So if I have permissions to view that, I should have permissions to view that app. We take care of all the Active Directory stuff. You can uninstall, install these apps. You can add these apps into the app catalog. You can add them into the SharePoint store. You can download them. We can take advantage of the site themes, and I'll show you this a little bit later on as well. The SQL backend, that's kind of our secret sauce behind there. Everything's baked into SQL, so we get all that full, rich transaction report stuff. If there's an issue going in with that data, it all rolls back if it encountered an error. You get that speed and reliability, and because we're baked in with SQL Server, we can give you that connection information, and then you can consume that with any other tool of choice. You can build Excel reports off that, Power View, you can use Crystal reports. If anything can take a SQL Server connection string, you can hook up to that data as well. So you can have other front ends for that data as well. In this next demo, Andrew's going to show you a little bit more about the runtime UI. He very quickly just created the app, and now he's going to show you a little bit more about the runtime specifics.
Thanks, Jeff. So here we're back in the exact same app that we created earlier, only we've added in some data to show off some of the runtime aspects. Other than that, it's the same functionality you got in the first 60 seconds. So over here on the left, we have our table selector. So there's 3 tables in this app, and as we select different tables, you'll see the view selector up here changes. So each view is tied to a table. So in our assets table, we have our list view. This is a type of view where you see the list on the left side and then the details for that particular item over here on the right. So as I click down different records, you'll see the details changing corresponding to that actual record. Now, baked right in with no extra code is this filter box. It's just a search box to be able to search through the records in the list. So if I wanted to see all the surface assets, all I need to do is type in surface, click enter, and it filters the list to just the surfaces on our team. Again, no code needed for that. And you can search on more than just the item name. For instance, if I wanted to see all the assets that are in a good condition, I can just type in good into the filter box, hit enter, and now it's brought up all of the assets that are in the good condition. So it filters on any of the fields that you see in this details section. Now to cancel out of that, just hit the X. Now up here on the top of our details section is our action bar. These are the actions that you can take against the current record. We could add a new record, we could delete this record, we could edit the record, or you can see grayed out here, we could save the record or cancel changes. Now since this record isn't dirty, we've automatically grayed out the save and cancel ones because they don't make sense in this context. Now some of the other views that I want to show off here is the datasheet view. This is more of your grid view with all the rich functionality that you'd expect from a grid view. You can resize the columns. You have filters on top of each of on the headers, so I could select just to show me the good or new, the items in good or new condition, and it filters right there. I can clear that filter. It lets you see all of the data that's in the table. You can copy and paste out of this view, and you can actually even paste into this view, and we will create those records for you in SQL. Our next view is the summary view, and here we're going to summarize by category. So if the more perceptive view will realize this is a group by query in SQL. But of course, you don't need to know how to use a group by query or how to write one. It's automatically done. You just tell us which field you would like to group by, which field you would like to summarize, and we'll show it for you. So here we've summarized by category. So there's 4 categories in our database: desktops, laptops, monitors, and surfaces. And as I click down, it will show me all of the values for that particular category. Now I'm going to switch back over to the list view to show you some of the controls we have and the different field types that we use behind the scenes. So I'm actually going to add in a new Surface Pro 2 that I recently got into our database. So I click the Add New Action Button item, and you'll notice we've switched from a view mode into an edit mode. So we have 2 different modes so that you don't accidentally change your data when you didn't mean to. So now we had the save and the cancel have been activated, and we can start adding in data. Now this item is a simple text field, so we give you a simple text box to type in Surface Pro 2. And I'll show you some of the other fields and controls we also have. This one is just a multi-line text field. It allows you to add in more data. I'll call this brand new as my comment for that. And this is a combo box. So there's just predefined values that you can set, you can modify them, and we'll give you a combo box automatically just to show those values. So I'm going to select that the condition is new. Some of the other field types and controls we have is a date control. And since we know that this acquired date is a date, we show you the SharePoint date picker right in line. You didn't have to do anything to get the SharePoint date picker. Just if you're using a date field, it automatically comes with it. So I can select that I bought this last Saturday. And here we have a currency field. So again, it's going to automatically apply some formatting to it. When I type in $900, it's going to change that, add in the currency symbol, and some decimal places. Now this next control is my favorite. It's kind of a search box, combo box, all tied into one. Since Access knows there's a relationship between the assets table and the employees table, in that every asset is owned by an employee, it can automatically do some searching on the employees table. So if I want to say that I own this Surface, I can just start typing my name, Andrew, and it's going to automatically search the employees table for all the values that match Andrew and show them to me right there. Then I can just select it. I didn't need to know anything about foreign keys, but we've got the referential integrity of SQL all behind the scenes. This category is that same autocomplete control. So this is a surface. So I just start typing surface, and there I can select that it's a surface. I'm going to go ahead and save this record. I'm just going to commit it back to SQL. And you can tell that we've changed from a view mode, from an edit mode, back into a view mode. So I can't accidentally change the data without knowing. You'll also notice that these autocompletes have now changed to hyperlinks. Again, because Access knows there's a relationship between there, it knows that Andrew Johnson is really pointing to a record in the employees table. So I can click on it right there, and it'll show me an in-context pop-up of that record. So this is my employee record in the employees table right there, all built in. There's one last control that I want to show you, and to show it to you, I'm going to flip over to the employees table just to show you some of the more relational controls that we have. So this is the employees table. There's the record that you just saw, my record in the employees table. And again, Access knows there's a relationship between the employees table and the assets table. So down here at the bottom, it's shown me all the related items in the assets control right here in this employee record. So this is what we call the related items control. You can see all of the assets that are assigned to me. And Access just did that automatically by knowing that there was a relationship between those two tables. And again, you have that awesome drill through functionality where I can go see that record that I just added. Now you can also, if I wanted to add an asset to myself, but I thought of this as Andrew owning that asset, instead of adding it to the assets table, I can also just add an asset right here. And it's going to bring me to the new asset view that we just entered all the data in the assets table, except it's automatically pre-populated that this one's going to be owned by Andrew since you said to add it to Andrew's record in the employees table. So now we're going to flip back over. I'm just going to go through a quick run through of some of the things that we just saw in that demo. So the polished professional interface that comes straight out of the box. Now, Jeff will show you some more customizations later, but this is what you got in 60 seconds without having to write anything. You got the table selector, where it shows you all the tables that are in your app. The view selector, where you can then choose the view that you want to see. The list, where you can search and filter, shows you all the records in that table. And then finally, the details section on the right that shows you more of the details for that individual record. Some of the controls that I just talked about was that autocomplete control. This is the searching and combo box. When Access knows that there's a relationship, it can add in one of these controls just to make data entry and data integrity a lot easier. The datasheet control is your regular grid view control, a very rich functionality that lets you see all of your items in the table all at once. The drill through pop-ups, that's also when Access knows there's a relationship. You can easily access the related record from the other one by just clicking on it, and it will open an in-context pop-up. You don't need to go over to the other table to see that item. You can see it right here in the context that you're in. The summary view, that's the group by query behind the scenes. Lets you summarize if you have a database with a large amount of data, it really lets you summarize that pretty easily. The related items control, also one of those great relational controls that lets you see records from another table that relate to the current record that you're on. And the action bar, that shows you which actions can currently be taken against this record to add, delete, edit, save, and cancel those changes. Now, Jeff is going to go talk to you more about customizing the app from the design perspective.
Thanks, Andrew. So what Andrew showed you was essentially some of our runtime elements. Didn't show you every type of control that we support. So what you see now is this is the exact same app. I just have it open within Access. I haven't added anything, haven't changed anything. This is the exact same app that we're starting with. Now, what you're not probably aware of is everything beneath the ribbon at this moment, this is actually an HTML page. We've downloaded this from the server, and this is being hosted within the Win32 client. So we have the ability to update the HTML on the server, and all of that will just get brought down into Access Client here. So everything that I'm showing here beneath here is actually an HTML page. We have the table selector on the left, as Andrew mentioned earlier. And as you click on one of these table selector items, the different views on the right side will show. When you select one of these, you'll see these what we call property callouts or charm buttons. Each one has a different set here. You can view the data. This will open up a datasheet view of the table right within Access Client here. That's an HTML page again. You can click Edit Table. I'll show you this in just a few minutes here. This will take you to the familiar table design surface within Access. I'm going to go ahead and click the Hide option here. And I don't know if you saw that all the way from the back of the room. When I click Hide, Access moved the Assets table down to the bottom of the list and it dimmed the font. That essentially means that table and all the views won't show in the runtime, in the browser. That doesn't mean you can't use that data or you can't open those views using like an open pop-up macro action. It just means it's going to be hidden. So imagine if you had like some admin tables or some settings tables that you didn't want people to see in the UI at the runtime. You can just click Hide. You can still use and surface that data, but it's going to be hidden. Let me go ahead and unhide it again. And it's back to being undimmed. If I want to change the order of these, I can just easily drag and drop. If I click Rename, this is going to rename the caption here. It's not going to rename the table. It's just going to rename the caption that will show in the UI here. So for people like me, I usually typically name my tables TBL. Yes, I'm old school. But if you wanted to have a nice friendly caption, you can have that. This other option on here, the formatting, you can select from a pretty large list of different icons that you can use for each of these tables. So we can just select a different one here. Let me jump over to the views over here. Each one of these tables will have at least one, probably a lot more different views associated. This assets table template gave us 3 views by default for the assets one. Let me jump up to the ribbon, Launch App here. It's going to do just what it says. It's going to open up your default web browser and show you this app in the runtime. You could also just toggle between having your browser and just click refresh. This just gives you a nice, easy way to jump back and forth. The table button here in the ribbon will toggle the Add Table screen. So if it's on, if it's off. And this is your entry point, as Andrew showed earlier. You can use one of our table templates to get started. We have a link down here. I don't know if you can see that from the back of the room. But this will open up a new blank table where you can actually start creating a new table from scratch. Or you can import data to get a jump start. And whenever you're importing data, whenever you're creating tables, we're going to create two views for you automatically. We're going to create a list detail and a datasheet view for you. You don't have to use those. You can modify them all you want. What we want to do is give you a jump start. Rather than traditional Access desktop applications, you create a table and you still have to create all the UI. We're trying to help you in that area. This View button is essentially just going to click this plus button right over here. It's just doing the exact same thing. This is your entry point to create a new view attached to the selected table in the table selector. So since I have assets selected, if I click and add a view here, it's going to attach it to this table and show it in this view selector. All we need from you is the view name. 4 different view types that you can see. Andrew has shown 3 of these already. You saw the list detail view. That's the list control and the details. The datasheet view is the grid one. And the summary view, that's that group by where you can select a different field to group by, and we'll help you build a group by query behind the scenes. That last one here is a blank view. We haven't shown that one. That's just essentially a blank canvas. If you data bind a blank view, it will only show one record at a time. So you'll have to build in your own record navigation to go next, previous. But that's essentially for a single item view. If you want to use it as like a message box, a blank view is another good choice for that. And that last option, was the record source. What table that you want there. You could also use saved query objects, embedded queries if you wanted for the record source. Under the Advanced button, I'll spend just a little bit more time here. The first option is query. Let me just click that real quick. This is your traditional query design view that you're probably very familiar with within Access. We only show items up on the ribbon that are applicable to Access web apps. So you won't see as many options as you would if it was an Access desktop application. But essentially, you can have all the other items that you're familiar with. You can define parameters. You can have totals queries. You can have returning a specific percentage. Let me just go ahead and close that. Oh, closed everything. Let me go back in. Under those queries, for our 2010 web databases, if you're familiar with, we didn't have totals queries. We heard a lot of feedback from that, and so we did make sure we added totals queries into our 2013 web apps. These view options here, blank view, list view, and datasheet view, these are the same view types, but if you use this entry point, it will create what we call a standalone view. It won't show attached to the table in the view selector across the top. Think of these as if you want to open them as pop-ups, but you don't want them as an entry point up on the UI. These will show in the navigation pane in here within Access where you can design, but these will just create a view that won't be associated up there. This macro button will create a new web macro, which is essentially a UI macro. And behind the scenes here, this will create JavaScript. And you can call this from multiple views, view control events, view events. That can be reused in multiple places. I do want to click the data macro option so you can see that. The data macro here, this entry point will create what we call a named data macro. Behind the scenes, this is actually going to create a full SQL stored procedure. I don't need to know T-SQL. End users don't need to know T-SQL. But they can have an approachable design surface for this. They just select from a set of actions that you're familiar with. I want to create records. I want to look up records. I want to delete records. I want to do a for each record loop and loop through and iterate. All those particular key scenarios that you'd want to do, and even with action queries, you can all do those within this data macro interface. We help guide you along the way so that when you select an action, we only show things within that block that are applicable, like set field, edit record. These are very powerful. If you click this data macro tracing option up here, we're going to create a tracing table. And so as your data macros are doing their work and you want to do some debugging, you can go to that table just to see exactly what's happening, essentially line by line. We show it in a datasheet view. And so you can actually see the where clause. You can see what ID is being passed around. Very powerful stuff there. But again, very approachable from the end user standpoint. They don't need to write T-SQL. Now, behind the scenes, we're going to do all that for you. And if you look at the T-SQL, there's a lot of complexity going on there behind the scenes. The last option I want to show under Advanced is OnStart Macro. OnStart Macro, think of this, if you're familiar with Access desktop apps, think of this as AutoExec. I don't know if I see a few people nodding their heads. AutoExec runs whenever the app was first opened. OnStart Macro here does the same thing. Whenever you browse to the app in the browser for the first time, or when you click a hard refresh, that macro logic will run. So this would be a good place to define global variables that you want to use throughout the application. This toggle button here for the navigation pane does exactly what it says. It's going to toggle the familiar navigation pane that you're familiar with within Access. You can see all the objects. You have your right click and go to design view. You can export the data. Let me toggle that back off. Now across the view, similar type of things. We have some entry points here for some different things that you can do. Open in browser, just a shortcut. It will open your default web browser and open up that specific view. Edit, I'll show you that in just a second. This will open up the design surface for this view. Rename, I'm going to go ahead and hit rename here. And all this is doing is it's changing the caption of the view. It's not changing the name of the view, the form behind the scenes. This is just going to change the caption. Duplicate is an option if you want to essentially make a duplicate copy. Think of it as like you were copy pasting right in the navigation pane. So I have a view, you spend a lot of time, I want to make an identical copy of it, maybe just have a different record source. Use this duplicate option. It's also another way to hook up items that weren't in the navigation pane, weren't in the view selector from the navigation pane. You can use that. Delete will actually delete the entire object, and it will remove it from the table selector. Let's jump into the design surface for the view itself. Here again, this is an HTML page. We're bringing it down. On the right, you have the familiar field list, and across the ribbon, we have some different controls. Let me go to the list control over here. This is where you saw the list. You don't see the filter box up at the top. That's just baked right in for you on the list control. You don't have to do any coding. You don't have to write anything. We're just going to give you that for free, so we don't even show it in the design surface here. I can choose to have a primary field, a secondary field. If I have an image in this table, I can have a thumbnail. So imagine if you had a list of products, you could have a little thumbnail of that product in there. I can choose to sort. I can resize the list a little bit, width-wise. Across the top is those action bar buttons. We gave you 5 built-in ones for free. These are the default ones. You can't modify the logic for these because these are built in. We control the disabling and enabling. I could delete these if I don't want to use them. I could selectively hide these if I wanted through UI macros. I could even create new ones by clicking this plus button and define my own custom macro logic action here. I could choose a different set of icons here and then define some macro logic in the on-click event. Depending upon what type of control that you've selected on the view, we will light up different things on the formatting option. You're familiar with the bold, italics, underline, different colors. We also display some charm buttons for each of these objects as well. So let me select this one. The data one will show, depending upon what view, what control you selected. There's always a control name. If it's a bound control, we give you a control source. You can use expressions as well. You can set default values. You can have tooltips if you want to have this visible or not. Enabled, you can have an input hint to give people a little help direction. I don't know if you saw earlier when Andrew was looking at the autocomplete control, it said find. That's that little input hint. If I want to go and add some logic on this one, I can do an on-click or after update event. If I jump into the macro design surface here, it's similar to the data macro surface, but we only surface actions that are appropriate for the UI. Think of these as your basic CRUD operations, saving records, editing records. If I want to navigate to somewhere, go to a control, set property. All that's within here. You don't need to know JavaScript. It's all done for you. We can easily resize controls, and the controls bump out of the way. If I select and move around, all these controls will just kind of slide out of the way for it. I can lasso a whole bunch of controls. I can use arrow keys just to move the whole group around. It's very easy, very approachable, and you can easily add more functionality on top. So right at the moment, I'm just going to, let me show you one more quick thing. If you select the view itself, we also have the record source for the view displayed here. You can choose to hide and show the entire action bar, and we have two view events, on load and on current, that you're familiar with. Let me just click Save, and let me just jump up to the runtime real quick just to show you what I've done so far. If you recall, I changed the caption of the assets list here. So now it says Asset List. Very quick. I just click Save, refresh, and I'm right up there. It actually shows this other new action bar button here. Let me go back down. Now for our scenario, our admin would really like to have a picture of the actual asset. It's very helpful for people filling these out just to make sure they've matched up with the right one. So I'm going to open up the Assets table in Design View, and I'm going to add in a new field called Picture. And the drop-down selection of data types, we have short text, we have long text, we have numbers, date, time, currency, yes, no, hyperlink, image, calculated, and lookup. We're actually have Andrew show you the lookup a little bit later on. But for at the moment, I'm just going to select image. And depending upon which options that you select here, we have some properties that you can select at the field value. You can add indexes, compound indexes. You can have validation rules that you're familiar with. These three entry points will create SQL triggers behind the scenes. These will be attached to that table. So anytime you want to insert data, you can have some easy data macro logic there. If you want on update, if you want to change some data, or on delete. All of that's very easy, but again, you don't need to know T-SQL. I'm going to save that new picture image. And after I've added this, it's not on the view by default because I've already modified that view. So I'm going to open up the assets list one more time. Right there on the field list, there's the picture field. I'm going to drag it in. Let me reposition it there. It gave us a label by default. In this case, I think I'll just leave it without. I'll resize it a little bit so that way we can see it a little easier from the back of the room. Save my changes. And let's go back up to the browser. Now you won't see anything at the moment because I don't have any images in here. Let me just type Surface again. And now if I click Edit, now I have the new control there. I do have a Surface image right on my desktop here. Click OK. And just as easily as that, the admin can actually start adding images into this application. Now that's a lot to throw at you in a short amount of time on the design surface. Oh, let me show you one more quick thing. Because we're actually baked right into SharePoint, we can actually use the SharePoint site themes. If you're familiar with SharePoint site themes, you can have kind of a custom company branding. All that's baked in. We will inherit the SharePoint site theme directly within. The formatting options that you saw on the design surface, there wasn't a lot there, but that's because we're actually going to be taking advantage of whatever options are there within that site theme. So let me show you this exact same app, but displayed within the SharePoint site theme. We have the colors that match. We have the watermark image in the background here. The hyperlinks are matching the color. And all of that is baked right in. Didn't have to know anything about CSS here. Access will just consume that data for you. Real quick, this is actually the fully baked version of the application that our admin is using. There's a lot more complexity here. It also knows who I am. It knows the assets that I have here. There's a lot of functionality that she's done with some customizations there. So with all those design elements, there's a lot that was going behind the scenes. Remember your entry points, you click the Open and Access. That second option there, right below there, that Apps for Office, that's going to be covered in Gary and Andrew's session tomorrow, how you actually consume those. But you just click Customize and Access. That will bring it down into Client. If if my machine, hopefully not, if my machine was just to crash right now, I haven't lost anything. Everything's up in server. So I don't have a local MDB file. I don't have a local ActDB file. All of that's up within the browser and being saved. We're just downloading that HTML page as you're designing it. For those advanced options, we have the query, the blank view, the list view, datasheet. Those 3 views listed, that will create the standalone views. There's one in here that I didn't call out specifically earlier, which you saw here in this slide at the bottom, is onDeploy macro. That is some brand new functionality that is also being rolled out to Office 365 right now. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But the server that this laptop is connected up to on Office 365 doesn't have that feature turned on quite yet, so we don't even show you that onDeploy macro. The onDeploy macro will help you with app upgrade. Click the navigation button if you want to toggle that navigation pane that you're so familiar with within Access. Creating tables, one more time, there's 3 ways that you can do that. You can use our table templates. If you want to use these, if you're using one that has multiple tables, we're actually going to create those relationships for you. If you want to start from scratch, you're more than welcome to do that. We're just going to have an ID field for you in the default. You can use an existing data source, and from here you can import from the various data sources that you see there, Access, Excel. If you have SQL Server data from somewhere else, you can import it in just to get started. You can also import a SharePoint list, and you can also do a special thing with SharePoint lists, which is link to it. And Andrew is going to show that in the next demo here. If you have existing Access applications, we get this question a lot. I have existing MDBs, I have ActDBs. How can I take advantage of this new stuff? But I don't want to throw away all the rich functionality I have in the UI. Imagine if you've split the database. You have your local, could be MDB, could be ActDB, depending upon what you have as the back end. And then you have a front end that has all the rich functionality. You can import the data in. All your data is up in now SQL. You can open up the connection information and then just use those as a link table to your existing UI. You don't have to throw away all that other rich functionality in that UI that you've built. But for free, you also get a nice web front end. You can go in the browser and actually edit some data there. Now you might want to hide some of those entry points and surface some of that data in the web browser. For the other data sources that you can link up to, the SharePoint list is the one that we really want to call out next, because that's some functionality that is unique to SharePoint lists. And Andrew, for the next demo, is going to show how we can consume existing SharePoint list data inside an Access web app.
Okay, thank you. So here we have an employee's SharePoint list that our admin already had. So in the previous examples, we created a new blank application, and she would have then had to start adding the employees back in. But what if she already had a SharePoint list with all the employees that she wanted to use instead of having to either enter all the data in or import it and have 2 versions of the data? So we're going to link to this employee's SharePoint list and replace the employees list that we have in our app right now. So to do that, we're going to go back to the exact same app that Jeff was just demoing, that we've been demoing all along. And we want to replace this employees table with the SharePoint list that I showed earlier. So we need to delete this table first. And first, I'm going to show you an error that Access is going to throw when we try and delete this. So if I hit the gear and hit delete and say I really want to delete it, it's going to show us this error. This is a referential integrity error, just one of those features of SQL that's really powerful to make sure that you're not messing with data in another table. So what it's saying is the assets table still has a lookup into the employees table, so we need to remove that first before we can delete the employees table. So let's go ahead and remove that field. We can scroll down, edit the table, select this owned by field, that's the lookup field. Just hit delete. It's going to save that back to SQL and delete that record out of there. Delete rows. Yes. Then go ahead and save that. Now we will be able to delete the employees table out of this application and replace it with the SharePoint list. So we're going to delete that. It's going to delete the table and the associated views for that table.
There's no undo.
Yeah. Now we're going to link to the SharePoint list. So we just select SharePoint list from down here. And this is the site that we have the SharePoint list in. Now you have two options here. You can either import the data from the SharePoint list, or you can link to it. And we want to link to it so that changes that the admin makes to the employee's SharePoint list will be reflected back into our app. So just click Next. It's going to look at our site for all of the SharePoint lists that are there. We're just going to select the employees list, hit OK. Now there is a trust dialog saying that we trust the data that's in this SharePoint list. So just trust it, and it's going to link to that list and create those views to let us see the data in that list. Now we need to go back in and add the relationship back between the assets table and the employees table. So to do that, we're going to edit this table again, and we're going to add in that lookup field. So we're going to call it assigned to, and this is going to be a lookup into the employees SharePoint list. So when I select lookup, it's going to launch the lookup wizard. That's going to help me create that relationship. So I just select that I want to look up into a field from another table. I want to look up into the employees list table. Now, if you remember, it always shows us a value from that table instead of the foreign key. So I'm going to select which value I want to show in the assets table, which is the full name of the employee. When I hit OK, that field has now been created. Save that back to SQL. And now I'll also need to update the form to include that field that we just had. So in the assets list view, it's currently that owned by field, which we deleted previously. So I'm going to delete those controls out and just drag the assigned to field from the field list onto the form and snap it into place. And then save that. So now we have actually replaced the employees list with an employee SharePoint list instead of having, so she doesn't have to import the data. Now when we launch this app, it's going to connect up to that SharePoint list in a read-only connection and use the data from the SharePoint list in the app instead of the data that was on SQL. So I can go over to the employees list, and you'll see that the values have changed. They now are the same values that were here in this SharePoint list. But that same rich functionality that Access gives you for relationships is still there. So if I go back to the assets list, I can reassign that Surface Pro 2 that I did earlier, this one. I can assign it to myself, only this time I'll be assigning it to a value in the SharePoint list instead of a value in the SQL table that was there before. So all that same functionality works across the two different types. Now just a quick recap on some of the points for linking to SharePoint lists. It is a read-only connection. So changes that are done to the SharePoint list are reflected back into Access, but you cannot write to the SharePoint list from Access. Then because of that, there's also no data macro support. So you can't actually run data macros on the SharePoint list. You can only run data macros on lists that are in Access. The list does need to be in the same site collection. That's just a security precaution that we have so that you're not reading lists from outside of your site collection. And currently, SharePoint lists are the only linking that is supported. So now Jeff is going to give you a demo of connecting up to the SQL Azure database in the back end that is hosting this, that we have for behind the app, and show you how to analyze the data with Excel.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew. So we've started off with the table template for our admin. We added some changes to it, showing you a little bit about the runtime. Now she wants to do a little bit more with it. She wants to add some nice Excel reports. She works with Excel a lot. So this is the fully baked application that our admin is using. As you can see, it's only showing my records right now since I'm logged in. This is the fully baked app that our admin uses. There's a lot more objects in here, a lot of tables, a lot of queries. If I want to connect Excel with this and analyze this, we have an entry point right up here on the file. We can see the server name right here. We can have the site URL right here. The server name, the database name is displayed right here. I'm not going to show you, but if you click this Create Reports button, this will open up a second instance of Access, a desktop one, and link all the tables for you. Very easy way to jumpstart, and then you can build Access reports on top of that. You could even have that front-end file stored up in SharePoint in a document library, and then everything's backed up. SharePoint's being backed up, that front-end's being backed up as well. I do want to show you this Manage Connections button. This is where you're going to be spending time if you want to open up the connection information and analyze it with different tools. These first two, this will open up the firewall rules. If you're on Office 365, if you want to open this up, you can use from my location or from any location. If you have multiple users, you should probably use the from any location. That opens up the firewall rules. The read-only connection information is not selected on this particular one, but if it was lit up, these other two options below it would be turned on. But the read-write connection is turned on. I'll show you that in just a second. We have view the read-write connection information. You can reset the connection password or disable all connections. If I click view read-write connection information, there it is. There's the server name, there's the database name, that's the username for the external writer, and that's the password. I see people writing the password down, so I should probably close that real quick. That is actually the app that our team admin is using. But I can take that connection information and then open up Excel. If you're familiar with Excel and the connection information, there is several steps that you have to walk through. We do have a blog post up on the Access Team blog that walks you through the entire process, the steps that you need for the connection information. But here we already have one set up. If I go to the Data tab, click Connections, click Properties, there's everything with the connection string. It's all right here. I can build a nice pivot table, pivot chart on this. This is live data. So based on this, if I scroll down a little bit, the blue, I believe, is the dev team, orange is the PM team, and the gray team is the test team. So I think the Access test team is kind of hogging all the resources on the team. If I was to refresh that data, it would get live. I could also open up SQL Server. SQL Server Management Studio, give that connection information. This is that same live SQL Server table. I can see all the information here, all the tables. We append access dot whatever name that you've given it. We have some system tables. This is the inventory list right here. I've just written a simple SQL query for this. Anything that takes that connection information, you can then utilize that as another entry point for that data. So on the slides at the bottom there, that's the link to that blog article that will kind of walk you through all the steps there. All you need is that connection information. That's that entry point under Manage. You can have read-only and read-write. So imagine if you wanted to send that read-only connection information to people that are just going to do some reports, and that read-write connection information to other people to build other things. But anything that can take that connection string, you can utilize it. If it's a web part, if it's any other tool set, you can still use that connection information. The SQL logon, and then for the unobscured table names, what we try and do is make it so it's a little bit more approachable. We don't have a GUID or anything there. For the Excel, you can walk through that connection information, authorize it, connect up, and then you can build all kinds of nice fancy charts. All the people that are familiar with Excel and love to make those charts and send it to their managers, that's all there for you. You can actually use that, put it up on Excel Online, and surface that within a web browser control if you want, as well within our Access web app. For backup and packaging, we're just going to briefly talk about this. We're not going to walk through a lot. There's a lot of steps here that if you wanted to do. You can take that app and you can package it up as an app package, and then you can install it on other SharePoint site collections. I could give it to Andrew, who works in a different company, and he could actually install it as well. That's also an entry point for upgrading the app. So you go to the file, click Save As. There's 3 options. Now, I'm not showing this because on this one, you would only see one. This is new functionality that is just rolling out right now to Office 365. The first option is Save as Deployment. This will actually just create a backup copy. So it will just have all the data within there, just as like a snapshot that if you want to, for your IT admins, are just real careful about doing that. The second one, this is where you can do app upgrades. You have a version 1, You've deployed it, you have a copy of the app and you're making some schema changes, you're adding some new views. You can create a version 2 of this application as an app package, and that person can then sideload that. Third option is save as new. This is what we have right now in the product. This will just create an app package, and you can selectively choose to have the data included in the app package or not. There is a session recording that we did at the SharePoint conference in March that has an hour and 15 minutes about just this, how to app package, how to do app upgrades. So there's a link to that session. It's on Channel 9. I encourage you to watch that because that functionality is just rolling out into our production servers right now on Office 365. So what's next for Access Apps? All the work that we've done since we had general availability, we've already added some cascading combo box to Office 365. We got a lot of feedback that said, I want to have a parent combo box and then a child combo box and have them relate. We've done some work for that, and that's already shipped over the summer. Submitting Access Apps to the SharePoint store, that's already been completed. We actually have some third-party vendors now selling Access Apps in the SharePoint store and making money on them. It's also a nice upsell. Sometimes they'll create a somewhat limited version of an app package and then have a nice link that says, hey, if you want a lot more functionality, contact me or build some reports. Coming soon are those two big pieces, the apps for Office integration, and that's Gary's and Andrew's session tomorrow. And the app upgrade lifecycle story, that's that previous slide that I just showed you. That's the link to the Channel 9 video. This is where you can actually upgrade an app in place. That was one of our key things that customers were asking for. I need to upgrade the app, but I don't want to upgrade it in place. I need to upgrade in a safe environment. I do want to call out some internal use for web applications that we're using in Microsoft. We've only walked you through one example here of an actual team scenario that we're using an Access app for. But we've used an Access app to reorganize and seat the entire Office division into their new teams after we shipped Access 2013. This is thousands of engineers. We helped them get seated using an Access web app that we created for them, literally within just a couple of days. We just finished the same thing with the Windows division. Thousands and thousands of engineers for the Windows division, and we use an Access app to seat everybody with that for an Access app. There's a very large ship readiness tracking app that we're using for some of our Office client teams. They're using this to track when features are completed, when they're rolling out. We have our LCA team using a tracking app for attorneys. There's a TAP program app that we're using internally. The Exchange team I know is using an app that is tracking a lot of their service issues. So if there's a service outage, they can go to this Access app to see what they need to do. We've also used a training app to track feedback. So I'm going to stay over here and keep talking while Andrew's going to just show 3 very quick apps that I created. I actually created these for my Access 2013 book. These are very full, rich Access applications. I use these actually as testing material too to help find a lot of product bugs as we were in development phase. This first app that you see is an auctions app. Every October, Microsoft has this very large giving campaign, and employees can auction off items, and it's all going for charity. So I created an Access app that kind of modeled the website that we were using for this, just as a kind of a proof of concept. So in this kind of fun app, you can actually bid on auction items. It does have some UI macros and data macro logic in place, so that way you can't submit a bid lower than needed. The second app is a fully rich restaurant management tracking application. It's for small businesses that have restaurants. They can track a lot of their business needs in here. They can track their employees. They can see the labor hours, their schedule. There's their invoice and purchasing information in here. They can run payroll reports in this. They can track when their orders are due and when they have deliveries. They can also do their scheduling. It's a really full application that I've helped find a lot of product bugs during the development phase. But this gives you a sense of some of the other things that you can do. The last application was based on a training application that we use for our team as well as some other teams to track what trainings the individual engineers were taking, and they could get feedback on those trainings, so that way if someone was interested in taking some training, they could look at this. Just a real quick teaser of some of the applications that you can use and the scenarios that you can use with Access Web Apps. It's not just for a small interdepartmental application.
So now our admin has a fully functioning SharePoint app to track the assets on the Access team. It's built on Office 365 where everybody can access it that she wants to be able to access it. The data is stored in SQL Azure on the back end, and it only took her a little bit of time, and she was able to do it herself without having to contact anybody else to build this app for her. Let's quickly go over the objectives that we showed earlier. I hope you've all been introduced to Access 2013 and Access Services, learned how you can create a SharePoint app with Access 2013, that end users can create these apps. If you want to customize them even more, you can do that, but end users can also create them and use them. They are centrally managed. They can either be on your SharePoint installation that you have on premise or on Office 365. On Office 365, you'll also be able to leverage SQL Azure. So they are different than Access desktop databases in that they are on the web where everybody can access them. So with Access web apps, the end user gets the experience they want, and IT gets the control that they want. A quick plug for a book that our own Jeff Conrad here has written called Microsoft Access Inside and Out. It will be available in the bookstore down below.
Thanks, Andrew. I will point out for my book, I utilized all the program managers, the developers, and the testers for this. So I was able to walk down the hall and just get all the tips and tricks for all the people that actually designed it, developed it, and tested it. So I do want to call out for the team. They were a big help in creating this. I do have one copy here, so during the Q&A session, I'll hand out one for a really good question. That's available in the bookstore. We do have some related content, as we've said at least a few times. Please make sure, if possible, you can go to Gary and Andrew's session tomorrow. This is going to be talking about apps for Office inside Access Web Apps. So you can do some nice charts. You've probably seen that bubble one before. You could easily consume that within an Access Web App. So they're going to have some really interesting demos. You'll find us later at the Ask the Experts tonight. If you have questions that we don't get answered here, we're going to be down at the Ask the Experts this evening. We'll all be sitting together. We'll probably have an Access shirts or something, probably some signage so that you can find us. We'd love to talk about scenarios. We'd love to talk about anything that you have questions about fully. There is also a hands-on lab, I think, downstairs as well. We have some other slides here about the developer platform and tools booth as well. Make sure you can reach out to that. We have some resources available here. We do encourage you to fill out an evaluation. That is very valuable to us. It helps us learn to make sure we're showing the right things, the right amount of content, the right presentation in the demos. So we do encourage you. Plus, get the chance to win that free Xbox. So with that, I do want to have one quick teaser. Andrew is going to spend just a quick minute and have a little teaser for that Apps for Office.
Okay, in this particular app, we asked everyone on the Access team to go into the app and add in the places that you've been around the world, all the different countries that you've seen, as well as what country you are actually from. So I just want to call out that this Bing Maps app for Office is now in our form, and this is sort of an extensibility mechanism. If you want to write your own HTML and JavaScript and you want to extend your apps, it's fully capable in this app for Office extension model. So here is just a quick visual of all the places we've been around the world. So the larger dot represents more people that have been there, smaller dot represents less people have been there. So altogether, you can now quickly see that the Access team is a well-traveled team. So we're going to go over these more in depth, how to create them, how they communicate with the app, and what the app model for that looks like tomorrow.
Great, excellent teaser there. So we really encourage you to come to that session tomorrow. There's some really interesting stuff. So right now we're going to open it up for Q&A, but I first want to give a quick thank you to Andrew. This is his first time presenting at TechEd.
Thank you.
He has presented at some internal events. For Q&A, we really want to make sure you go to the microphones so that they're recorded for us and we can hear as well as everyone else can hear. So you do have a question? Yes?
Yes, actually I have a couple.
Yeah.
First of all, great presentation. In my opinion, probably the best we've seen so far.
Oh, good.
So first, my question is, can you attach a document?
Can you attach a document?
Yes.
At the moment, you cannot attach a document,
Okay.
but you can link to a SharePoint document library list.
That was the answer to my second question, or actually another
You
question.
actually you can link to those. That is a
Okay, I
supported
saw it was
scenario.
a list. I saw the documents above, so that is supported a document library. You can attach to that?
Yes, you can.
Great. So my second question is kind of twofold. Do you have a record limit or a data size limit?
So good question on that one. Database size limit, if you're on Office 365, it is a 1 gig limit, and that's enforced by SQL Azure for us. If you're on-prem and you have a local SharePoint 2013 and a local SQL Server, it is whatever your admins deem as much space as you want.
Great.
Now, if you want to give them a little extra money, I'm sure they can give you a little extra space. Record limit, we don't conceivably have a record limit. We're on the test team. We've actually done tests with millions of records. We've had millions of records in that data sheet view. And we've scrolled, we'll page in, I think it's about 200 records?
Yep.
About 200 records at a time. Even across that filter, it's very snappy. There isn't essentially a record limit, at least none that we've, none that we've come across so far.
Okay.
Good
Thank
question.
you.
I have a free book for you here. Thanks, Gary. Other question?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions as well. Sorry, it just
Sure,
was
go for it. That's
racking
fine.
them up. Number one, the access that you upload, does that actually create then a team site? Is that at like a sub-site in the main site? Is that what that's actually doing?
Well, you can think of it, it's an app within that site.
Okay.
So it's
No, it does not. It creates a SharePoint app,
Yeah,
which
it-
is something new in SharePoint
Okay,
2013.
it's not a sub-site. It
Correct.
didn't
It is
convert
not a
to a
sub-site.
sub-site with its own list and
for,
stuff.
for our 2010 web databases, if you're familiar, it actually did create its own
Okay.
separate site.
That's why I
But,
was asking
yeah,
that.
for this one, it's just an app within that site.
Then my other question is the workflows that are built into SharePoint, are they, could you apply workflows to those lists?
I
and
had a
letters?
feeling somebody was going to ask that workflow question. So we definitely got a t-shirt for you for that one. I would say at the moment, no, we're not hooked into the workflows. That's because our data macros are essentially SQL triggers and stored procedures. However, you could have a web browser control that surfaces a SharePoint list, and as you edit and edit data, you can have workflow being kicked off for that. We've heard quite a bit from customers about workflow. That is an important scenario that we are looking at. Can't make any promises right today on that particular thing, but workflow is definitely something we've heard a lot about.
And my last question is if you had a VCS connected list with external data, can I use those lists as well?
I'm going to answer that with something I heard at the SharePoint conference and very near after the SharePoint conference that somebody had done that. So I'm going to say yes, that's possible.
So the apps for Office that I showed at the very end is an extensibility mechanism, and you can read and write data from the app through those. So if you wanted to connect up to an external data source or do anything like that, you can do that through those apps for Office, and you can come see exactly how to do that tomorrow at our session.
That's actually a nice lead-in for one of the first proof of concepts that we used for apps for Office internally was we were seeding the Access team. We were moving into new offices. And so we wanted to seat people in their offices, but they could pick which office based on seniority. So what we did is we had an app for Office that actually was looking up and writing data to a SharePoint list. So as I picked my office, it created an event receiver, created a new record in a list, and we had an email workflow that kicked off and sent an email to the next person that says it's your turn to pick. So technically you can't directly call a workflow, but using an apps for Office, very good plug there, you can hook into that into the extensibility story. Yes?
Yes. For each Access apps, each create a separate database. Am I right?
Yes, each app has
Each
its
app.
own database, either on-prem on your
One-to-one.
SQL or in SQL Azure.
Do you think it affect the performance?
Excuse me, what was that?
What about the performance? If
Oh,
you
the
get more database.
Well, for performance, if you're on Office 365, we're going to take care of everything for you. If you're on-prem, the recommendation is typically that the SQL Server database that is having the Access apps is its own separate one apart from the SharePoint config database. That one's separate. You're going to get some better performance there.
Okay, thank you.
What, t-shirt? T-shirt?
You want to go ahead back?
In the back row?
Yeah, so I kind of have like maybe a feature request question.
Sure.
Okay.
So rather than using that employee list, can it pull directly from the users from SharePoint, I mean from Office 365 or Active Directory? I think in making like SharePoint lists, you can include like a people.
People picker.
Yeah, people
We've also heard that kind of feedback as well. That is, again, another scenario that we're looking at. We do have expressions currently.
Okay.
If you do user display name, that will surface the actual display name of the person that's actually logged on and using the app.
Okay.
And we have user email address, which will do the same thing. It will surface the email address from there. So in the fully baked computer assets tracking app that I showed briefly,
Yes.
it knew who I was and only surfaced the records for me. But a people picker type of thing is also something we've heard a lot of feedback from, and our team is looking into that as well as an important scenario for actually getting that Active Directory information.
Okay.
Thank you.
That'd be great. Yeah, sure.
Who's next? Back row?
Yeah. So in terms of maybe migrating a database that's on-prem to SQL Azure, so I have for example, Access front end already linked to a SQL backend. Is it a feasible migration strategy to import that SQL or transfer that SQL up to Azure, use that connection information on your existing front end, and then you can redevelop
Exactly.
the works up in SharePoint?
That's exactly one of the key scenarios that we see happening. And you get essentially a web front end in your SharePoint site all built in for free. But you can still use your front ends and all the rich functionality that you've built already.
Okay.
Oh, t-shirt. Well, we just have one more question before we're going to get kicked out. Oh, too short. Over here.
Is there capabilities of conditional formatting of fields based on either permissions, like roles type thing, or by
Good question.
other data that's within
Good question. So on that one, we don't have a specific conditional formatting feature, but I can easily write UI macros that will change colors of some specific things. We didn't have time to show it, but in that restaurant app, if the invoice is balanced, I have a red label, and I say the invoice is not balanced. If the invoice is balanced, it's got green, and it has a white label on top of that. I can just selectively hide and show different controls based on who you are. So there isn't a conditional formatting feature per se, but you can use the UI macro logic that we have in place to do a lot of that for you. You can use the caption property. You can set visibility, you can set different colors, back colors. So there is some functionality that is conditional format-like within our UI macros.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have to cut out. We're going to go move out to the hallway. If there's more questions, we'd love to answer more questions. If you come to the Ask the Experts tonight, we'll answer a lot more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is the first session of the day, so I appreciate everybody coming straight from breakfast, probably a little bleary-eyed from everything last night, staying up late. Introduce myself, I'm Jeff Conrad, and with me today co-presenting is Andrew. Both of us work on the Access test team, so we hope to make sure that everything with our product is bug-free and works very well. What we want to talk to you today is about building SharePoint apps with Microsoft Access. We've been giving a similar type of presentation at other events recently, and for the most part, we found a lot of people still haven't heard about this, so we're hoping that we're doing the same thing here. If you haven't heard about this material, this is a good way to introduce all the work that we've done with Access 2013, built on top of SharePoint and Office 365. We're going to have about 65 minutes of presentations and demo, and then we're going to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A at the mics. Probably going to have lots of questions, so please make sure if you have questions, just wait till the end and we'll have plenty of time for you. The session objectives today, we want to make sure that you're introduced to Access 2013, all the great work that we've done. If you're already familiar with Access, that's great. If you haven't heard what we've done with 2013, this is the right place to be. Some of the key takeaways we want to give you is that when you're building Access 2013 web apps, they're on top of SharePoint. They're very easy to create. They're very approachable from the end users to create applications. Pro developers could also do a lot with these as well. But the idea with Access and the rapid application development, we're just extending that from the desktop into the cloud. And the real key thing is that these are centrally managed by IT because they're within SharePoint and SQL Server. So, how many of you are familiar with Access desktop applications? There's probably quite a few of you in the room. I'm sure as some of these items that come up on the screen, you're probably familiar with some of the problems with Access desktop applications. It's difficult to track how many of these MDB files and ActDB files are floating around the organization, how many of these are on local shares, who's backing these up. It just gives you a little bit of differentiation there. With our Access web apps, we are essentially a SharePoint app. If you're familiar with apps for Office, you've probably heard some of these sessions already. You're going to definitely hear some more throughout the week. Think of it like an app for Office is essentially like an extension, an add-in. We have a session tomorrow that Andrew and Gary from our team are going to be leading. We hope you can go to that. We're happy and pleased to announce that you can actually consume apps for Office inside Access web apps. That functionality is literally just starting to light up within Office 365, probably any day now. And so we have a session tomorrow afternoon. We really hope you can go to that. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there with maps and charts. When we think of Access, there's a different range of different skill sets involved with creating Access applications. Throughout its 20-year history, Access has been around. The end users that can create application, we want to make sure it's very approachable, but there's a big grow-up story. And usually professional developers have made some very mission-critical applications within Access. For Access 2013, we want to make sure, and that's what we're targeting, is that end users can create these applications and get started very quickly. That doesn't mean a more experienced professional developer could not create an Access application. In fact, they can probably add a lot more functionality on top of what, say, an end user is just using, one of our templates. At the far end of the spectrum, we, of course, have the really high-end professional developer. The professional developer can create apps for SharePoint as well. They can also create apps for Office, which can then be consumed by Access web apps. We typically don't see end users going to be the ones that are actually going to create apps for Office, but they can consume those. If you've heard Napa throughout this week, those can be used to create apps for Office, but keep in mind that will just be consumed by an Access web app. So that's tomorrow's session. Visual Studio, of course, is for the very high-end professional developer. We also think of the simple versus structured. One really nice thing about how mission-critical are some of these. For the most part, when we talk with IT doesn't like Access per se. They usually want to purge Access completely from their system. It doesn't negate the fact that the end users still need to create Access applications. There's a need for those particular very quick, rapid application systems that are just maybe small, interdepartmental type of applications. Sometimes these grow up into very mission-critical applications. So this leads us to the next question of why would you want to build a SharePoint app on top of Access? We hope to answer that within the next hour. We essentially now have two products within one within Access, and this is how we think of our product. We have all the desktop application stuff, and that's on the left side of the screen there. All of that functionality is still in the product. You can have full, rich VBA. It's used by millions of people. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of applications out there. How many of these are being used? All of that functionality is still there. We haven't taken that away. But what we have done is made a large shift to doing Access web apps. And that's what we're going to be covering today. We're not talking anything about the desktop applications. With the Access web apps, the data is now stored directly within SQL. That was a huge shift for our team and a huge amount of work. When you're creating an Access web app, if you're on-prem with SharePoint 2013, it's going to create a local SQL Server database. If you're on Office 365, it's going to create it in SQL Azure. And of course, that's completely managed by Microsoft. It's accessible through any web browser. Doesn't matter if it's Internet Explorer. We're much more open-ended with other browsers, so you can actually use Access Web Apps with any of the current web browsers. There's essentially no code. You're just writing macros if you want to do some of the logic. We will actually do a lot of the work for you in creating these applications. Throughout this week, you're going to hear the word apps probably way too often. Probably a little confusion on what the difference in the different apps model type is. So this slide
Access app package. If you've already created an app and you've packaged it together, you can move it from site to site, and you would do that through this link here. We're going to go ahead and create a blank one. So all I need to do is hit create. Now, our admin needs to be able to track the assets on the Access team. There's about 70 members of the Access team, and we all have laptops, desktops, monitors, surfaces, all these assets that belong to Microsoft. So the admin wants a way to track them and see who they're assigned to. So currently, right now, we are creating a SQL Azure database in the back end, because this is Office 365, and a SharePoint app in our site collections that is going to show us the UI that corresponds to the data in the back end. So there you see we've already created the app. We can now open it. Now this is a blank app, so there's nothing in it right now. So you come to a landing page where it's going to tell you that you can start designing your app. Now the design time for these Access web apps is done in the Access client, and the runtime stays here in SharePoint on Office 365. So to open this in the designer, we can either click this link right here, or you can go up to the gear in the top right and hit Customize and Access. Then just open that up, and this is going to launch Access and connect it up with the SharePoint site that we just created and give us that design surface to start working on our app. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is define our schema for the app. We could do that in a number of different ways. If we already had existing data, then we could come down here to create a table from an existing data source. So you could create it from Access, you can import data from Excel, from SQL Server, or link to SharePoint lists. If we knew the schema we wanted and just want to start creating tables, we can start adding blank tables to this application and start defining our schema that way. But as Jeff mentioned, we're going to use a new feature in Access 2013, which is table templates. So we know that we want to track assets in this application. So we just need to search for assets, and it's going to bring up all the table templates related to assets. Now, if I click this table template, it's going to create some SQL Server tables, in the SQL
Access is that it's approachable and simple from the standpoint of, say, for example, an Excel user. It doesn't require a lot of skill set to just add a new column into Excel or add a formula. We want that simplicity. The downside to those simplistic systems is sometimes you don't have the data control that you want. You don't have relationships. On the structured side, this is where you have the full high-end professional applications. These are the ones that take hundreds of thousands of dollars or more of application time. I'm sure some of you have been involved with some of those applications where they, of course, always landed on time, always on budget, never went over. Of course, I see people shaking their head already. So what we want to make sure is, for Access, we're kind of taking that sweet spot right in the middle. We can still have the simple design surface for creating the apps, but we still have all the structure and all that rich functionality behind the scenes. Because we're baked right on top of SQL Server, because we're baked right in with SharePoint, we already have all that rich functionality, permissions, and SQL Server all behind the scenes. In this first demo, Andrew's going to show you very quickly how he can create a new SharePoint app using Access 2013. He's going to start off using one of our table templates. And he's going to show in roughly about 60 seconds, so don't time him because he's going to be talking along the way. But in just a matter of a couple minutes, he's going to create a new SharePoint app.
Thank you, Jeff. So we are going to create an Access web app so that our admin can track the assets on the Access team. So to get started, we're in our home screen for our SharePoint. We just had to click the Add Lists, Libraries, and Other Apps button. Click that. Now it's going to show you several SharePoint templates that you can use to create an app. But we're going to create a blank Access app. So I just need to search for Access in the box. And right here is where we can create a blank Access app. So all we need to do is click on it, give it a name. We're going to call this one Assets. Now you'll also see here that you have the ability to upload an Access